All right, for the sake of your time, we're going to go ahead and get started. So I've been looking at the chat saying, well, there's a couple of interesting things. It's always an interesting sort of agitare thing that happens of like, what is going to be the cross section of people that are going to be at this event? And, you know, obviously there's going to skew somewhat more military than I think normal public events do, considering, you know, the nature of agitare. But there's always this really interesting cross-section of industry, civilian, contractors, et cetera, that it's really interesting. So I just wanted to take note that there's a really interesting cross-section of people, and I'm seeing friends from foresight communities, from Air Force communities, from systems thinking communities. Like, yeah, this is a very agitatory thing to happen. I'm just like, we're purposely cutting across these boundaries in order to talk about these things. It's how these things go, and it's really nice to see. But I've been looking at your stated experience in systems thinking, and here's what I initially planned when I planned this thing. It's like, there's 100 and something slides here. And I would have talked through all of them. It would have taken, you know, about the time that I said, you know, systems thinking in 2 hours. I'm not gonna do that. I had already had an intuition that I wasn't gonna do that. Going into like a week after saying that I was going to, I was like, no, we can do something different. And then I got sick, and I was like, well, now I'm definitely not doing it, because talking through 100 and something slides doesn't seem like it would do the best thing it does for my voice. So for those of you who are coming from Cyberworks or formerly from Cyberworks, know that I do a particular type of method of talking about a topic, and where I ask people what are their questions about the topic, and then I map the topic as people say their questions about the topic. And then once sort of all the questions have been, at least the first wave of questions have been asked, I then start addressing all of the questions. I've done it for, you know, an hour-long session, hour and a half long session. And I think this could be the best bet for us today. So what we're going to do, in the nature of, or in the spirit of doing things that way, is if you're able to get on audio, let me know what you would like to learn about systems thinking that you either want to, you know, like reaffirm, relearn, or just like, obviously you're all here to learn something about systems thinking. Like, let me know what those are. Come up on audio if you can, come up on video if you'd like. And if you are unable to do either of those things, I will try my best to monitor chat. But this is the part where I'll stay quiet and just like come up on audio. Daniel, if you want, you can help people come up so that they're not fighting over who's going to come up next. And I will start mapping the questioning so that we can make sure that we address all of people's questions. Not everybody at the same time, please.
I have my question is, on the basic definition of systems, it seems such a broad word that I almost want to ask what would not be covered in systems thinking. It's a very broad word to me.
No, definitely.
I see Curtis put in the chat, what are some activities to develop solutions from a systems thinking approach? Solutions. And how do you examine the relationship between components or topics?
What was that last one?
How do you examine the relationship? I need you to mute. Between components or topics. For those who don't know, Austin and I are like sitting 4 feet from one another right now. So, although Austin's standing, I believe.
On top of me being sick, my my computer's running very slow, so bear with me. I'm seeing that somebody says the screen is blurry for them. Is that the case for everybody? Okay. I will do a thing real quick. Is that better? Can I get a thumbs up?
Yeah, that's
Cool.
way better.
Thanks. So if that's the extent of the questions, what we'll do is, I'll answer these ones, and then I think by starting to answer some of these, there'll be more questions. We'll just do these in a couple of rounds, and we'll start to highlight the specific perspective that I will be talking about when I talk about systems thinking. First, I guess it's a matter of some introduction would be in order. Oh, we got a late addition for methodologies. I like it, so I will include it. Specifically related to problem solving. And I'm going to relate these to activities from my own brain. And what you'll see is that I'm already engaging in systems thinking, but I just haven't told you how yet. That's fine. That's going to be a part of the process. So first thing that we are going to talk about is to answer, I believe it was not Menage's question, it was Monica's question, which is what will not be covered. And the best way I think to talk about will not be covered is to talk about from what perspective I'm going to be talking about systems thinking from. So I was trained by Doctors Laura and Derek Cabrera out of a university called Cornell. I didn't mean that to sound pretentious. I almost forgot the name of the university, so I was trying to stall the university name as long as possible in this sentence until I remembered it. From Cornell. And then went on to do a master's level in teaching, master's level quote unquote in teaching systems thinking through the Cabrera's research institute called the Cabrera Research Lab. So they have a very, I think it's fair to call it a very different perspective on what systems thinking is, as opposed to other methods of systems thinking that you might be familiar with. So the definition that I'll be using for systems thinking is not going to be what you might be familiar with when you talk about general definitions that come from disciplines like system dynamics, for example. But they're going to be pulled from this particular school of thought around systems thinking. And what you'll see here is somebody already hinted at one of the aspects of systems thinking, right, is relationships. Well, I'm going to fill that out with 3 more components. Distinctions, systems, and perspectives. It is hurting my brain that these aren't in the order that they're supposed to be. So I'm going to do myself a favor and order them in the way that the methodology is called. So the methodology is called DSRP, Distinction, Systems, Relationships, Perspectives. It is also called DSRP. There's DSRP theory, and then there's the practice of DSRP. This is the specific perspective on systems thinking. Now, to answer that question then of what will not be covered are going to be more system dynamics related principles around systems thinking that you might see in books like The Fifth Discipline by Senge, or Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows. I love Dana Meadows' work. That is not the perspective that I'll be taking on systems thinking within the course of these 2 hours. So Monica, does that sort of help clarify kind of the bounds that we're talking? We're going to use the lens of distinction, systems, relationships, and perspectives to talk about systems thinking, and that's going to sort of bound our left and right.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I just was looking for a basic definition. Thanks.
Of course. And to get into a, we'll call it a more formal definition, DSRP theory basically says that systems thinking isn't a thing that you do. Systems thinking is an emergent property of following these 4 simple rules of, actually not following, of being aware of these 4 simple rules: distinction, systems, relationships, and perspectives. And we'll actually go into each one of these in detail as to what they mean a little bit later after I answer this first round of questions. I did see Briston Keller mention The Fifth Discipline as being an excellent book. And yes, while I like parts of The Fifth Discipline, I do want people to be aware from a academic perspective that I think the most important contribution that Senge made in The Fifth Discipline is applying systems thinking perspective to the idea of it being a thing that an organization needs to do in order to learn. That right there is what Senge actually did for the field of systems. He mentions a lot about, I tried to avoid jargon just as much as possible, but yes, organizational learning was kind of his crowning thing in my perspective of this is what he is saying that it's different than just about everything else. And why that's important is because the Cabreras also take that perspective and use it to develop another way of looking at a system from looking at an organization from a system perspective. We'll talk about a little bit later, and it's called systems leadership, which also has its own sort of breakout of distinct parts, but we'll get into those later. We'll just put in a little place for it right now.
Austin, just really quick, can you define system in simple terms?
Yeah, explain like I'm 5 system. The most useful way to explain what a system is anything with more than 2 parts that interact with, and those parts interact with one another. That is the simplest way to describe them. So like these 2 different things on my desk aren't really a system. Although if you get to an abstraction above, as in things that were on my desk, we're now again talking about systems. But just these 2 things by themselves, they don't interact with each other. There's no connection between these 2 things, other than the fact that they belong to this larger system of things that can be considered on my desk. But in and of themselves, it's an interconnection of any 2 parts, 2 or more parts, and whatever outcomes of them there. And that is me simplifying that to a degree that avoids the jargon, which can often sort of muddy the meaning of things for people who are just getting into this field of systems thinking. And so what it means to do systems thinking is to be aware that you do these rules. And we'll get into the exact science of these here later. Now, before I can talk about specific activities which lead to solutions or any specific problem-solving methodologies, I think what would be useful is to sort of look a little bit deeper into what these 4 parts are. So here's going to be theory part. This is going to be on your test, so no, I'm kidding. But this part is going to be sort of your. Sorry, my phone is deciding to listen to me at the weirdest times. I don't know if that's ever happened to you. But in order to talk about activities, first we need to talk about what is the underlying theory and methodology here, and that will help inform all the other things. So I'm going to mention a bunch of research, and I am going to not post them in chat until after the fact. So as long as you're here, there'll be an email after that'll have all the academic papers and stuff that you can reference for, longer term absorption of these things. So I'm not asking you to take me at face value, but all resources will come after the fact, and then you can call me out for any misleadings, I guess. So what is Derek and Laura Cabrera's DSRP perspective on systems thinking? Well, through a series of studies, they found that cognition operates as a complex adaptive system. Now, if you're not familiar with complex adaptive systems, what you need to know about them is that we already talked about a system, right? So a system is any 2 or more things that interact with one another. A complex adaptive system are going to be, again, a system, so any 2 or more things that interact with one another, following simple rules that result in complex behavior. And for the sake of this discussion, I will not go into detail what I mean about complex behavior, but we could talk about anything that couldn't be anticipated by just following simple rules. So for example, DNA, it makes a really good example of what a complex adaptive system can produce, right? DNA follow really simple rules of, okay, this nucleotide can only attach to this nucleotide, everything that I learned, at least in, I think, high school biology, when I was learning about DNA, right? These nucleotides connect in this certain way. And that makes the entire basis of what we call life, right? Simple rules leads to hard to predict behavior, complex behavior. Yes, it is important, but I think it gets into extremely complicated distinctions that aren't worth it at this point of the conversation. So while I agree with you, David, for the sake of where we are right now in the conversation, I'm going to hold off on making that distinction. It will come, trust me, it will come. But just at this point of the distinction making, I am not going to make that distinction yet. Speaking of distinctions, they found, right, that our brain follows these simple patterns, these simple rules that create this type of complex behavior, right? We make distinctions, right? And we make a distinction between, correct. Sorry, I'm addressing David's point. I do want you to know that they are not interchangeable between complicated and complex, but I don't necessarily want you to know how I'm making that distinction right now. But we'll come back to that. In fact, just to promise you that I will get to it, I'm going to put it right here. Well, actually, what we'll do is we'll do complex identity systems. And we'll do complex systems, complicated systems. And they're related to systems thinking, and they're related in one way. That is also related to systems thinking. So distinctions we make every day, right? When by making a distinction of one thing, say, I'll make a distinction between myself and Daniel, who, even though he's right next to me, there's a somewhat of a distinction between Daniel and I.
Not as much as you might think on the surface.
Yeah, not as much as what might be like normal for most people, but there is at least some form of distinction between Daniel and I, in that even though we might share a brain, we at least inhabit different bodies, so that's useful. So when we make distinctions, what we make distinct is an identity and an other. And I want to be clear here that saying that there is an other isn't the pejorative way of saying of making an other, right? We'll get into some of the more EQ aspects of systems thinking in a second. Well, in a later part. But there is a relationship between what it means that when you make distinctions, we're making an identity and an other is really important when we talk about what it means to have emotional intelligence. What they also prove that what we also do empirically, cognitively, is make we break systems down into part-whole structures. And so what I mean specifically by a part-whole structure is, this is my teacup that is keeping me alive today because my voice is not, I have a sore throat, et cetera, et cetera. Here's the hole. Well, actually, it's not the hole because I left the lid in the kitchen, in the cyborg's kitchen. But let's pretend that this is a hole for a second. Lid, the rest of the cup. Now it's two parts of lid and cup, right? When does cup stop becoming cup? It becomes an important question all of a sudden, like systemically, like this is a cup, but this is a cup also. So when does it stop becoming a cup? How many parts of this cup can we take apart before it stops becoming a cup? And that's why it's important. Like, yeah, I'm talking about a cup, so it kind of sounds like I forgot to ask how people feel about swearing, which is what I usually do when I open up these things. But it's too late, so now I can't. It might sound like I am making things up. I was going to say swear words for that instead. But like, let's talk about, there's a whole philosophical principle, like how many planks of a ship, do you need to remove before it stops becoming that ship? Like if you just replace it with another part, et cetera, right? So we make these distinctions between parts of a system and the whole of the system. There are also relationships, right? Somebody talked about, ship of Theseus. There's also this relationship aspect. And again, we do all of these things cognitively already. So what I'm asking you to do when we talk about, okay, how do you do these things, isn't going to be a matter of doing them. It's going to be a matter of being aware of you doing them. And from a relationship perspective, that's going to be action reaction. And what does that look like, Austin? Well, what that looks like is somebody's question was to identify activities and systems thinking that can, in fact, I think it was Curtis's question, if I'm not mistaken. What activities and systems thinking can lead to solutions? So we can think of, and this is good to talk about how I've been doing systems thinking this whole time. You can think of Hold on, I'm having trouble with application. So activities and solutions as being two distinctions that I'm making. The relationship between this activity and the solution is going to be that an activity leads to a solution. So each arrow here is pointing to some type of relationship, and the way that they're categorized is by action reaction relationships, or action and reaction components, I should say. Give me 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. My voice is already starting to hurt a little bit. And then perspective, and I've already talked about, oh, this is the Derek Cabrera's perspective on XYZ. Every perspective has a point and a view. So for instance, here's systems thinking. This is the view, right? We are viewing systems thinking right now. This is what this activity is for. Now the perspective that we're looking at is through the doctors Cabrera, right? So now we could say here's a point with doctors Cabrera that we're having on systems thinking. All right, just to codify what I'm talking about when I'm talking about points and views. I'm seeing Menage's view of the presentation has frozen. Daniel, are you seeing that it's frozen?
I think it's still good. Can you move something on the board for me? Oh, she says it's back.
Perfect. I mean, it's typical computer problem is that it's a problem until I mention it out loud, and then now it's fixed. And so this is at the root of all of DSRP theory. We make distinctions. We see things in part-whole structures. We see the action-reaction relationships. And we are always in perspective or are being perspected on at all times. And what's being asked isn't that you have to do these, right? It's just being aware, like, okay, when I'm saying systems thinking, so like when I'm saying, okay, systems thinking in 2 hours, I am immediately having to take a perspective of what do I want to teach you in these 2 hours. I immediately have to determine what are the parts of systems thinking that are going to be most valuable to you in these 2 hours, et cetera, et cetera. So now we can go back to what people talked about with activities that lead to solutions. And Daniel and I actually had a really interesting output recently on a project that we're working on. Actually giving one. Sorry, office chatter. That was getting me a little bit distracted. So what we'll do in order to talk about this output is we'll talk about really quick what the parts of systems leadership are, right? Which are, that's not how you spell vision at all. Vision, which is a part of systems leadership. See how that's going to work here? Vision, mission, capabilities, and learning. I'm not going to ask you to know these right now, but just for the sake of talking about the parts. So what Daniel and I did for this group of people was we had a bunch of people who had to cooperate with one another and figure out how they can start best, basically finding a way to collaborate with one another. So they had like disparate, they like geographically separated, but they had to learn how to work together in order to maximize the function of the roles that they serve. And so what Daniel and I did is we used, hold on, I'm going to use some arrows here. We used the perspective or better yet, we use systems leadership as a lens to effectively say, okay, what we're missing here is an organizational alignment. So let's just start mapping things that might be missing from your organization. So things like vision, mission, capabilities, and learning. I don't want to talk too much about maps because this is danger territory in my brain, of which I will go a very long time talking about maps, and that is not why we're here today. But mapping itself as an activity is extremely useful in leading towards solutions for either a group or for yourself. Here are a couple ways that I have mapped using this method that I'm using in front of you to develop solutions. So I'm involved with a lot of, actually, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the paper that I came out with. I have a peer-reviewed paper that's in the process. I have a paper that's in the process of being peer-reviewed. That is in the Journal of Systems Thinking. Anyway, in that paper, I was mapping the function of a specific management role. And when I was mapping that management role, what we found out was that management role didn't have a capability of anticipating changes that might be happening in the future, to then develop how, or then to determine how they might develop people in a established career within the military. So what mapping does, and now this is the part where I'm gonna have to put mapping here as a distinction. This is the fun part of Danny and I being right next to each other. So what mapping does is it helps you become very explicit with what things mean, and by mapping them, you can play around with them. Like, okay, maybe VMCL up here isn't connected to activities; it is connected only to, for instance, mapping. And all of a sudden, I have just moved an entire relationship in place for, right. So mapping serves this twofold purpose of making physical your thoughts, or not just your own, but the collective thoughts of whoever you might be working with. But then you can also manipulate them in space. So when we talk about systems thinking activities, the reason why that is so important, mapping is so important, is because at the heart of DSRP as a methodology is that it's all about understanding mental models. And I'm having trouble spelling today for some reason. Now, the Cabreras have a really interesting perspective on mental models, and I will describe them in the same way. If it doesn't make sense, Mike, raise your hand and tell me that it doesn't make sense, and I'll explain it in another way. The way that they describe mental models is that it is a product of information plus the way that you think. Specifically, it is the product of, specifically thinking is a DSRP structure, right? Remember I said DSRP is empirically validated as a thing that happens in reality. Give me 1 second, phone's ringing. Sorry, there's been a lot of office busy today. So thinking, or DSRP, is empirically validated to exist cognitively, but it actually we won't get into this, but it exists outside of human cognition also, including finding perspectives in like elementary particles, for example. So mental models are basically described as the way that you structure information. So when we look at the way that I structure information, the way that I'm going to structure information is different than the way that Manaji might structure information. It's going to be different than the way that, Jonathan's going to structure information, which is why it's so important to be explicit with how you structure this information. So when we talk about activities, all of these activities leads to people making explicit their mental models to then be able to manipulate and change them based on input from others. Like Monica might say something differently about what it means to problem solve, which could involve, okay, obviously you're drawing a relationship between activities and problem solving methodologies, but do all activities lead to solving problems? You're right, Monica, for example, right? Like my mental model is going to be different than anybody else's, which is why any systems thinking activity that you can mention, and I think mapping is the exemplary one from the perspective of the doctors Cabrera, is because it makes explicit those mental models and it makes it able for you to then manipulate them in space, whether that be a digital or physical space. I'm going to save problem-solving methodologies for a time. Right now, I want to go with another round of questions because I need to drink some tea. So having said what I have said within the last, I think I've been talking for 30 minutes, what questions do you have now? And I will try to have everything, actually, here, let me do you a favor. That might make things a little bit more visible. Questions do you have now?
You froze up.
I should just.
Oh, I have a question. When you were talking about the cup and its attributes, like it holds a liquid or it's made of ceramic or it has visual appeal and its functions, all of those are attributes of an ideal. Where does that fall in the DSRP model?
Oh, Austin just got kicked off. Oh, but it looks like they're not kicked off.
All right, I'm back.
That was fast.
My computer, again, not cooperating for whatever reason. I'm sorry, Curtis, can you repeat your question?
Yeah, I was trying to figure out, like, when we were talking about the cup, so like a cup's function is it holds water, but its attributes, it's ceramic, or that it has visual appeal, blah, blah, blah. Where do all of that fall inside the model of the DSRP system?
So what I would do is, okay, I see what you're getting at. So here's how I would sort of characterize it, is that attributes are a function of the part-whole relationship, if I can nest that properly, right? And now this gets tricky because we get into some really philosophical territory. So I'm going to ask you to not dig too deep philosophically, because then we get into a place that we can talk for hours about. But from a strictly materialist perspective, you can't separate the attribute from the thing. So therefore, the attribute, like the material of the cup, the color of the cup, et cetera, is just a part of the whole of the cup. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think so. I was just trying to think, is that a part of a system or is it like a relationship? But I think that gets into the philosophical nature, and just it's easier to say no, it's part of a system and stick with that.
I would say that attributes are part of the system.
Okay.
But I like that question alone, like even just wondering, okay, a cup holds water, right? Is that an attribute of a cup, or is it the cup's relationship with water? The attribute would be the shape, but the fact that it holds water is it, in the way I would map it, is that that's the relationship with things that are positioned a certain way with that as part of the system, right? But even that alone, just asking yourself the question, is this a relationship, or is it a distinction, or is it a perspective, right? You already run into some really interesting like explorations of a cup, which is one of the cool things about systems thinking, is it makes you ask new questions that you wouldn't normally ask.
Yeah, I wanted to actually look at that from another perspective, which is from the perspective of Taoism, which I didn't know Taoism was going to come up when I started this meeting today, but it inevitably finds its way. In that, I forget which chapter it is now. I think it's within like in the 20s, I think, of the Tao Te Ching, which is, it talks about basically it talks about, okay, on a wagon wheel, there's the hub and spokes, but it's sort of the space in the middle that makes the wheel turn. Or for example, in a cup, you have the shape of the cup and whatever, like handle of the cup, but it's the emptiness of the cup that makes it do the thing that you need it to do, which is drink water. To me, from that philosophical perspective, is an aspect of its relationship. And so that comes to, okay, the function of a thing can be found in at least the relationship of something. What I think DSRP teaches us is that the function of something can be the product or cross product of any one or combination of distinctions, systems, relationships, and perspectives. A bicycle, for example, is, I think, a telltale case of its function coming from not just obviously the relationship, but of a very specific relationship between a myriad parts, just like a watch, like a mechanical watch. There are innumerable parts of a watch that I couldn't even dare explain how they work, because it's all magic to me, basically. But without the relationships between those many, many parts, you don't have the functioning of a watch. But that goes down a more philosophic rabbit hole than I think people attended for. Let me check the chat to make sure I didn't mess anything up. Oh yeah, that's a great book, Adam. I actually, incidentally, I got into systems thinking and Taoism at the same time, not knowing how connected they were. It was just a weird fact of my life. Okay, Curtis, I hope that helps. If it doesn't, we can talk offline until we get to something that does make sense.
No, that helped. Yeah.
Okay. Does anybody else have questions? Based on anything that they've heard. So
I see Daniel Griffith said he was still interested in the EQ aspect.
yeah, I think now is a good time as any to talk about the cross-section between system and EQ. So here's how we'll talk about it. Actually, here, hold on. I think there's actually a really good slide in the slide deck about this. And so I'm going to actually defer to this slide. If I can find it. But as I'm scrolling, what I will say is there's when we talk about emotional intelligence, one significant part of it is in understanding the perspectives of others and understanding your own perspective, right? There's an intra perspective, there's a intra aspect of emotional intelligence as well as an inter aspect of emotional intelligence. And I can't find it, so I'm going to start trying to find it. And what we find, and what they have found, is that by doing DSRP, right? DSRP is a thing. Like, I even make the mistake sometimes. I say by doing DSRP, we already do DSRP. We just become more aware of the distinction systems, relationships, and perspectives. We mean by making it a more explicit part of how we think, of how we talk. So by, for instance, saying, okay, I am making a distinction okay, let's say I am in an organization and I'm saying I am making a distinction between laborers and managers, right? So by making the identity of manager, then there is at least an other, which is laborer. But there are others that we as systems thinkers have to consider, because again, the idea is to make explicit as much as possible these identities and others that we're making. So systems thinking forces you to partake in parts that constitute emotional intelligence by deliberately incorporating those who would normally fall into this other perspective, right? If from like a social perspective, if I am working on developing policy for charging electric vehicles, and my distinctions that I'm making are focusing in the city of Arizona, the other is already like, okay, everybody outside of Arizona, but more specifically, it's people who might live in suburbs and or exurbs of Arizona that me as a systems thinker have to take into perspective, otherwise I'm not doing my job, right? But normally people are like, oh yeah, just put them in the city. But that's not the only place that people would travel to, especially considering technology that's enabling people to move further away from city centers. That's not happening in Phoenix, but it's happening in other city centers across the globe, right? So what systems thinking does is by making specific these mental models, by continuously making yourself explicit and then testing those mental models with other people and applying those towards people, towards social situations, you are sort of like here's the normal thread of EQ, but it's like attacking it from a different angle, but while referring to all aspects of emotional intelligence. Is that helpful or no? Or is there more questions? Because it probably is related to that or to anything else. I'm not hearing anything yet, and that's fine. So here's what we can talk about now. I'm going to go to a blank thing. So you're going to watch me surf a little bit. Put this in Agitare stuff. The software I use, by the way, is Plectica. It was initially developed by the doctors Cabrera. They don't have stake in it anymore. I also don't have stake in it. it works really well for this specific thing because again, it was developed by the doctors Cabrera. But you can map DSRP in a number of ways. And this is what we're talking about now, which is what does it mean to system movement? I also see there's two things in chat. Oh no, so Stephanie, you and I actually need to talk on that exact point after this, because the answer is no. But there's like a furthering of that perspective that we can take that I think would be really helpful in general. So I think you and I should have a conversation about what would it mean to sort of cross-pollinate systems thinking into DEI type work. And then from Daniel Griffith. Yeah, it is general in explanation because it's sort of it gets at it from a tangential perspective, right? The whole literature around emotional intelligence, very well established. But when you look at sort of what the core competencies are in EQ, and all the supposed benefits of EQ. I say that because there is scholarly disagreement on to what extent is the benefit of EQ. But for whatever the benefit of EQ is, you can get at the benefits tangentially in part through incorporation of DSRP through the things that I mentioned. But it is, you're right, very general. Daniel has his hand raised.
So one of the things I noticed when incorporating specifically the perspectives portion of systems thinking is that when you start mapping, you map a system, and that is generally going to capture your perspective on that system, because what you're doing is you're making your mental models about a system explicit. It's useful to try and make it less perspective driven, but it's always going to be a perspective. When you start adding alternate perspectives, like identifying other agents or individuals within and interacting with that system, some really interesting things happen. And I think this is where it relates to EQ just as a general concept, because when you start adding in perspectives that are conflicting, or you have perspectives and you start adding the emotional or psychological effects of parts of a system, that's when you start thinking in terms of, well, what could we do, or what does that mean about how we should manipulate, change, nudge, or modulate this system based on our now incorporated understanding of other people's perspectives of the system. So I'd say that the emotional stuff really enters in when you start talking about those differing perspectives. And that's one of the more powerful things. And it's one of the things you get to latest in the systems thinking process, in my experience. It's not necessarily the latest, because Austin's done I've watched Austin do these really weird and interesting things with mapping with perspectives in mind from the start. But that's where I'd tie it into EQ specifically.
Yeah, and I wanted to add to your point, because for some reason I didn't think about perspectives at all, and I'm a big old dummy for that. But I wanted to show, now the perspectives that I'm going to show are more articles in this case, but I couldn't find a good example really quickly on like specific people, but I think it shows how perspectives here's how I will +1 to the generalization. EQ in part is about having empathy, and empathy is a topic that people feel a million different ways about it, and some of them are negative, some of them are positive, some of them are just sort of ambivalent. I would like to characterize it in this way, in that if we're going to talk about empathy as a thing, and we talk about it as a useful thing, I'm on board with that. And let's figure out from a systems perspective, how do we tell when we're practicing empathy? Well, if you are practicing empathy, you are taking somebody's perspective. Now, if you're taking somebody's perspective, it is more than just seeing, like, you're not, it becomes a really interesting systems problem, which is there's two different ways that you can do this. There's the I am taking a perspective on your perspective, right? And that is what I'm calling empathy, versus by taking your perspective, my mental model changes, which I think is the more radical idea of what empathy is. So if I can practice empathy with you, I am effectively changing my mental model to understand what your experience is. And the way that I'm going to showcase this is through some research I did on the future of mobility. It's not important what the topic is, because it's going to be a visual understanding more than a textual one. So as we talk about mobility, each one of these articles came from a different perspective. You can see a lot of nesting systems right over here on the right-hand side. What's important here is that none of this came from a single perspective, right? Here's one perspective, right? Of here's this one article, and here's just some things that were mentioned in that article. Here's two articles now. Now we've combined two articles' perspectives together. Okay, we're building out the picture, right? And then you can, so on and so forth, keep adding perspectives. And we are developing this model with these combined perspectives. Now, what happened as I built this was that as I added perspectives, the fundamental structure of this changed over time, because it was no longer just my perspective or the perspective of one article or two articles. It was the perspective of at least, I forget what number I was at the end of this, 8, 9 articles, plus inputs from professors and other things. And so when you talk about empathy, no, definitely not a waste of time. It's, I think, a really useful way to look at what are some of the useful applications of DSRP, of systems thinking outside of your normal, oh, we're going to solve a problem and solve the problem this way. I think empathy is or specifically emotional intelligence is a really useful way to look at it. In this case, I had to this. So Stephanie was asking if I can go back to the map, which is in my research map and my this one. I had the word lenses, and she was asking if that was another way of perspectives. The answer is no. It was a distinction that I had to make personally, because what I needed to realize in this research was that not only was each article sort of informed by its own understanding, but some of them were very purposefully using, for instance, a justice and like a DEI perspective as it relates to mobility. So I needed a place to put them. It is a perspective, but lens isn't necessarily another way of saying perspective. It's just something that I needed to make as a distinction so that I can say, here's this social justice lens that we're using, or that this paper was using, that I want to make sure it is explicit. What we're going to do now, unless there are any questions, is talk about how you can go about mapping. I'm actually going to do this 2 ways. One of them, I don't know how it's going to play out live, and we're just going to kind of go for it. So first thing we're going to do is we'll do the digital version first. So we'll go back to the map I made. And here's how we'll do this. Does somebody have like a really big burning problem? Just like something they need a second brain to just help think through something. And what to talk about, I guess, would be the other one.
How big do you want this problem to be, Austin?
It will not make a difference for what we're trying to teach. So
Okay,
if you want to do just like a massive problem, then I am game for that.
all right. So King County here in Washington has stated that racism is a public health crisis.
Okay, so we're talking about racism specifically through the lens of King County, not country. King County. So when they say that racism is a public health crisis. So what I'm doing right now is I have three different distinctions, right? I have, okay, King County. I have, okay, racism, right? Then we have this idea of there being a public health crisis. And so we know that based on what was just said, okay, there's a relationship here, or at least within, and I'm sorry, who, you said King County made that claim?
Yes, that is one of the things that we are working on here. And typically King County here in the Seattle area is progressive in this way and addressing things like this. And then it becomes a model, or the equity and social justice work becomes a model for other places that want to adopt it.
Right. Okay, so now when we talk about this problem of there being a public health crisis as it relates to racism, have they been explicit on what that means?
That's where it gets a little complicated because there's many different facets of it. And they use sort of the determinants of equity. Currently, there are 14 different determinants of equity.
Okay, so don't tell me like what the 14 determinants of equity are, but you're saying that the determinants of equity are the measurement that they're using to determine whether or not this specific thing is a public health crisis. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm sorry, what did you call them again?
Determinants of equity.
Right. So we have a new distinction that has, you said there are 14 parts or 14 aspects of them. We're not going to get into the details of what each one is, although if I was doing this for, if I was actually doing this for somebody, I would 100% go through, okay, what is each single part of this? What does it mean? Now, we have determined that these determinants of equity are measuring whether or not, so the determinants of equity measure whether or not something is a public health crisis. Now, so we have, what things have we made so far, right? We made, there's a perspective, right? This is King County, and King County is saying specifically that racism is a public health crisis. We have a relationship, we have two relationships functionally between racism and public health crisis, and then determinants of equity being a measure on whether or not something is a public health crisis. So, okay, we have DS, we have a little bit of, right, there's 14 parts here in the system that we're not going to get into detail although I'm really interested in knowing what those 14 parts are. But again, not enough time to, really dive deep into them. But functionally what I'm doing is I'm starting to build out a picture, right? Okay, using DSRP as the lens, we have to make these distinctions. And so the next distinction that I really want to make actually is what response does King County want to have in like solving or rectifying this public health crisis?
I think they just want to make sure people have all opportunities available to them in an equitable way. I know it sounds crazy. This is a huge, you asked for a big problem. So
I am for what we're trying to teach. Again, it's fine if it's a really big problem. What I'm trying to get people to understand is big or small problem. There are ways that you can just start mapping this and ask, like, it's already getting me to ask what are, to me at least, as an outsider, some really interesting questions, which are, okay, if we have, so what we had actually, just as I was about to say the question out loud, I realized what the answer was, which is I need to nest this in here, which is obvious, but I didn't think about it, in that these determinants of equity are just a part of equity as a concept as a whole, and what they want is equity for their residents as a whole. What they're using to measure it are these specific determinants of equity. And again, I don't know what those determinants are or how they're measured, but each measurement, which is an interesting perspective to have, which was and I'm not asking you this question, Stephanie, I'm just gonna put it here. But historically speaking, measurements have a perspective. So it's not unheard of to say, okay, there's a perspective being taken here on this measurement that we're using, and we should say, okay, let's be very specific to say that this is a measurement. And so what other measurements are we possibly making, and what are those measurements being informed by? Even things as benign as the metric system, for example, are taken from a very specific perspective of making, I'm hedging my words here, something I'm not the best at, but in certain situations I have to. The metric system is created from the perspective of making a lot of state affairs legible. If different people in your state are using different measurements, that makes things more difficult for your statesperson. There are a lot of implications behind what I just said that I don't want to get into, but the function of a measurement for legibility and what does it mean for society to be legible immediately makes, the measure being a metric system or whatever system they're using, informed by a perspective. And so, okay, we have distinctions, which are these rectangles, we have relationships, which are these lines, we have perspectives, which are also distinctions from a point on a view, and we have systems, which are basically just, nesting one thing within each other. So this is one way you can map things sort of digitally. You can do this on Miro, you can do this on insert, graphing software of your choice. I've done it on a number of things to various success. I don't want to pick Plectica as your answer to systems map because I don't want to be a shill for a company. No, I didn't hedge my words the way I should have. Oh well, too late. Right, so here's the other way. We're gonna do a quick experiment. I'm not sure I'm gonna do this yet, so bear with me. I'm gonna take this with me. You get a little bit good probably. And hey, it's fine. I turned it off. Okay, all right. So what we have over here, yeah, there we go. Is my whiteboard. Let me see if I can put this down. And it's hopefully the right way for you. Because we're gonna do this by hand, just to show you that you don't need software. I have a notebook full of just like random diagrams in the same way that I could have shown you a lot easier, but I wanted to do this live for whatever reason, because that's how my brain works. Just to get a thumbs up, can you still hear me? I took my headphones off. Okay. So, don't mind what's written on the board. That's just me thinking about other things. Interesting enough, I did. Yeah, that'd work. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to show you a way that you can do this by hand with just, you know, board in an expo, well, some type of dry erase. And what we're going to map is we're going to map, I don't know, let's map. Somebody give me just like a problem to riff off of in chat real quick. Like just enough to get me going. I know what we'll do. We'll talk about global development. That's what we'll talk about. So let's see if this is going to be legible. Okay, cool. It will be. So first thing that I want to make a distinction on is development. So I sort of just encased it in brackets. You can also do a square. Right. I typically enclose things in brackets for shorthand, but it means the same thing. Now, there are a lot of ways you can think about development. In the way that I'm going to think about development, I'm going to use Amartya Sen's perspective on development. He wrote the book Development as Freedom. That's what he wrote. So now I'm taking a perspective, right, of Amartya Sen. I'm just going to put his initials. I'm gonna put like a little 1. That's a number 1 here at the top. And I'm just gonna put a number 1 up here. So now you have, okay, we have Amartya Sen taking perspective on development. So we have 2 distinctions and a perspective indicated in numerical order. Right now it's just 1 on the thing that we're taking perspective on. Now, Amartya Sen talks about development. There are trying to figure out the best way to word this, but basically there are 5 core determinants of freedom. One of them is economic. Another one, yeah. Can you stop screen share? Yeah, totally. Is that better? Yeah, cool. Okay. So one of them, okay, so again, because probably it was super small, I didn't realize. So we have Amartya Sen, we've got number 1 here, really small perspective on development. So 2 distinctions, right? So identity, and there are countless other that we'll have to make sure that we're accounting for as we go through this. And then in his perspective of development, there are parts, right? So what are some of the parts of development? Well, there's economic, as I mentioned. There is social, There is also political freedoms. So on and so forth. There's 5 of them, but so on and so forth. So, okay, we have development, which has these 5 parts that are nested in here, and you can kind of depict them as nested in a number of ways. This is one way to do it. And then, okay, well, development is in relationship to freedom, as I keep mentioning, which will make as a discrete thing over here. And then we know, since the book is called Development as Freedom, that there is a relationship between these 2 things. So we can draw an arrow. And so just really quick, just to show, okay, here's how you can start mapping things on a whiteboard or on a notebook, so on and so forth. Don't need to keep going through this. Unless there's interest in talking about that, but that's for another time. I'm gonna disorient you again and you can see my palm. So what becomes really interesting about systems thinking in this way then is that you can systems map anything. And by systems mapping, you can, oh yeah, I guess people might want to see me still. And by systems mapping, you get to really interesting outcomes. And I mentioned that with, making explicit of what your mental models are. And, you get a similar thing by visualization through other means, right? By just drawing things on a board together. What DSRP does that makes it different in that sort of way is how explicit the rules are, 1, 2, how the rules of DSRP can be translated from something that happens empirically in my own head and then translated to diagrammatically how to picture it. Now I'm going to pause there because there's one more thing that I want to talk about there's one more thing I want to talk about before I close out, but I wanted to see if there are any questions at this point.
You're muted.
I was just saying that I don't hear any questions and I couldn't see the chat. But okay, cool. So here's the last thing that I want to talk about, and we will close out our time together. I'm trying to find the map that I was working on. There it is. And what I wanted to talk about specifically, trying to think, navigate on my keyboard and talk at the same time. It's not working out. Okay, here's what we do. So the Cabreras had a perspective, and I've mentioned this already, on systems thinking about organizations. They have found that they equated organizations less to sort of mechanical structures that have all these rigid hierarchies to something that is more organic, like the root of the word organization is supposed to imply. And what we find is that socially, that's exactly what happens in organizations, right? Despite whatever hierarchy we fall on, we often talk across these hierarchies. We often, depending on your organization, it might be more controlled or not. But organizations can effectively operate as organisms, and So they have made that correlation more explicit to say each organization follows these rules of having a vision, a mission, a set of capability systems and learning systems that help it navigate any space. And systems leadership, well, these rules aren't, and this is my opinion now, not the opinion of the Drs. Cabrera. The VMCL framework, as they call it, VMCL, Vision, Mission, Capabilities, Learning, while it isn't as, like, it's not, it doesn't exist in the same way that DSRP does, right? In DSRP, distinction, systems, relationships, and perspectives are things that are empirically said to exist outside of human cognition. This isn't the case for VMCL, for Vision, Mission, Capabilities, and Learning. That being said, to use it as a lens for your organization can be really useful. And we talked at the beginning about organizational learning. This is where this comes into play. Because there's two parts of learning within a systems leadership framework. There's individual learning, and then there's group learning. And these are both a part of learning, of your learning, of your learning system, right? So individual learning is part of learning. And then there's group learning. So individual learning happens when your mental model changes. So if this is my model of development right now, and somebody's like, oh, here's this other text that you should read that's really useful, and that changes effectively my model for what development is, I have officially learned something. Group learning is when we all, so assuming we were all in an organization, changed our mental models together. Thank you. So when we all share our mental models, when we all change our mental models together, we are effectively learning as an organization. Now, I think that's really important to highlight because some people think organizational learning is as simple as, sharing perspectives with one another. But and we talked about it before when we talked about empathy, if your sharing of a perspective doesn't change my mental model for something, then I haven't learned. And therefore the organization hasn't learned. And so the part of VMCL, of the systems leadership framework, that I really like to mention is that when you get systems thinkers together, people who practice systems thinking together, and they start following the rules of DSRP, what you start doing is you just do it by yourself. You learn, you partake in individual learning. You start doing it as an organization, as a group of people, you start doing group learning. Now, where this gets interesting is if we were to define the culture of an organization, culture could be defined as a static snapshot of whatever the collective group mental model is of that organization. Which means then that the act of changing a culture of an organization is done through changing the mental models of each, of the organization, which means changing the mental models of, each subgroup in the organization, which means effectively changing mental models of each individual of an organization. And so when people say, when you change culture, people's like, oh, you change culture from top down, or, oh, you change culture from bottom up. I think you can see that the answer is kind of both, right? Culture comes from bottom up, right? If I start changing the rules that I follow in an organization, if I start changing, if my mental model has changed because I've met Emmanuel and she has made me think something entirely different that is way outside of my current organization, that has effectively changed my mental model. And then when I now interact with Daniel, who I work with every day, that pollutes, but in a good way, his mental models, right? Because Daniel and I have a close affinity with each other. When a significant change in my thinking happens, he's at least going to hear me out in a respectful way before he tells me that I'm full of something that I forgot to say if everybody was okay with before I started. And then if I am able to convince Daniel that this perspective that Emmanuel shared with me, that is exactly, you get this mental pollination, which then changes how your group learns. So like you have officially changed the group or you've officially changed the mental model of the group, or at least I've started to change that. And then when the group finally turns over to this new mental model, okay, we've changed the group culture, and then so on and so forth, sort of like a viral imagination of how that might spread. So culture can change bottom to top, but bottom, even the wording actually has an interesting perspective, right? Talking about looking at things from a systems thinking point of view, think about how we talk about organizations, and I'm falling prey to this myself, and I just realized this, which is why I want to highlight it now, because I'm like, oh, this is actually really interesting. Because we say, bottom up or top to bottom. What is that? What is that? What does that mean? Like the perspective that informs is me talking about the org chart. That's all I can really think of that would inform why I say, from top down versus bottom to top. I mean, there's possibly some moralistic things that could inform that also, but there becomes an interesting perspective play. And okay, where is this phrasing coming from? What other distinctions am I missing by saying bottom up and top down, as opposed to some other form that I am not aware of? And that's when we start saying, okay, now we can start pulling this thread a little bit and saying, from a systemic point of view, what does an organization mean? Is there really a top of an organization or a bottom of an organization? So on and so forth. That is me just, there's like a meta process that happened there of realizing what was coming out of my mouth and then like analyzing what was going on from a systems perspective. I want to be done now because my voice hurts. Is anybody going to like hold me at gunpoint for not living up to the full 2 hours? And or if there are significant questions, I will answer them. But I want to save I think the next 25 minutes for people talking with one another or having any specific questions. What I wanted this to be is a primer. Again, I'm going to send you resources that are going to fill in a lot of the gaps of what I was saying. And what I didn't want was to bore you with like 100-something slide PowerPoint, because I don't know, there's something like I saw myself saying it and then I was like, no, I can't do this to them. My voice apparently got equally taxed, but that's okay. So any questions? Is there anything in conversation that you want to have? Daniel pointed at me. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and we'll go from there. And so, yeah, just want to say thanks. And if there aren't any questions, feel free to start dropping off. I'll stay around for people who might have more targeted questions that they didn't want the large group to have. But I think giving you back some of your time, I think it could be the best thing that I can do for my voice. And then we can have a more proper dialogue with whoever wants to stay around for questions.
There was one question that came up earlier that I thought was really interesting. which was how do you see systems thinking feeding into design thinking? Which I think is a really interesting question because one of the,
I have an answer to that question.
okay, you go first.
You're not gonna like the answer to this question, Daniel. So close your ears. No. So here's the thing. So, and for those of you who want the slides, I will be able to send them to you as a resource. Just remember, especially with the slides, but with other materials as well, if you use it for any external facing things, that you credit the proper people that need to be credited, i.e. Derek and Laura Cabrera. To Daniel's point, or whoever's point that it was originally about systems thinking, design thinking. There was a lot that I couldn't talk to you about as it relates to systems thinking in this specific methodology that I'm going to need to talk to you about now in order to talk about design thinking. There are these things that the Cabreras like to call cognitive jigs. So you can just write them down. J-I-G. I'm writing with my left hand, so don't bite me. Cognitive jigs, right? What cognitive jigs are is there are a mental shortcut of some sort to help you structure information in some way. So lists of things are an example of a cognitive jig, right? Like I have a to-do list. And so it's like, okay, 1, I need to do this, 2, I need to do this, 3, I need to do this. Well, this is just a part whole structure, right? Here's the whole of things that I need to do. And here are the parts, right? So a cognitive jig from a systems perspective is any cognitive shortcut that helps you structure information. And there are a number of cognitive jigs, including one that I discovered on accident. But that's a story for another time. But the reason how this plays into design thinking is by way of another jig called the S2P jig. So what the S2P jig is, and I think you'll be aware of it as I say it. But what it is that it is a jig that uses a system that becomes a perspective on a thing. So for instance, if this up here, not this stuff, but this up here, like this, if this was, the system of development and freedom and its parts being the system, if I use that as a perspective to a problem, that perspective now confines whatever else I'm going at, right? That is the S2P jig, right? I can use this as a perspective on a whole other system to inform it in a number of ways. And if that sounds familiar, it's because that's exactly what frameworks do. Frameworks are a system, and I mean system not in the part whole way, but in the DSRP way, in that they have distinctions, systems, relationships, and perspectives. So they're a system of things that are taking a perspective on a new thing. Design thinking is a framework. Therefore, design thinking is an S2P jig, which means that, yeah, design thinking is a useful framework, but you can also just as easily make your own framework the same way. Now, you should, test your frameworks, right? There's a whole other concept in systems thinking, again, that I couldn't mention, which is the ST loop, which is without being able to test my mental model, there's no way to determine if it's valid or not. So I need to test it in the world somehow to validate it. But if I do validate that mental model, then I can just use that system that I validated in the world as a perspective on a new problem. And that's how frameworks are created as a whole. So by understanding design thinking as a framework that fits into DSRP theory in this way, I think you get a lot of interesting implications. Daniel, I don't know what else you wanted to add, but feel free to now.
Yeah, the question of how could systems thinking feed into design thinking or support design thinking, I think is useful because I'll use the example of like the what's it called, which Summer of Design, which is taught by the Darden Business School and Karen Petty Holt. Their model goes what now, what if, what wows, and what works. So what now is just a way of mapping, of identifying the status quo, right? And one of the problems that people run into with design thinking frequently is pigeonholing. They'll sort of narrowly drill down into a very specific area and lose sight of the larger environmental picture, which is arguably one of the things that design thinking is supposed to avoid, is to design with a comprehensive awareness of the systems that a thing is nested in. But a lot of teams, I think, struggle to maintain the holistic awareness while focusing on the narrow, problem. And as a result, a lot of solutions end up being very kind of iterative because they get invested and they get excited about the specific thing that they're doing. And so this is a really common critique of design thinking. I think that a system like DSRP can help give people, like as a practice of thinking in terms of, oh, this is part of a larger whole, as well as, when you're talking about wanting to empathize and understand the levers that different stakeholders might have, there are some really clear places to plug systems thinking in that are already done in a way. A lot of the methods that are employed could be understood as systems thinking. For example, a user journey map or a user experience map are really common design thinking methods, that some of which come from other schools of design, or a stakeholder map. Those are systems thinking because you're depicting a systemic picture with you're making distinctions, you're determining relationships, right? But I think incorporating a method like DSRP into a design thinking process would help overcome some of the hurdles that a lot of design thinking efforts struggle with. So that's kind of my view, is there's really useful way to incorporate systems thinking into that practice.
Yeah, and here's I think a really easy way to apply DSRP to anything that you're working on. And it's basically just by asking yourself simple questions as it relates to DSRP. So if you're, for instance, from a design thinking perspective, you're mid-project, you're like, if you wanted to ask a question about distinctions, you can ask something like, is there anything or anybody that we haven't mentioned yet? Or by naming this group of people this thing, who might we be excluding? So to ask questions from a distinctions perspective, you can have something along those lines. From a systems perspective, I think is relatively more simple. Of like, okay, are there any other important parts to this thing that we're looking at? Or does this thing that we're looking at nest into an important larger whole that is also part of our analysis that we need to look at? Relationships and perspectives also ask similar questions. The exact questions don't matter. As long as your questions get at DSRP, you are practicing DSRP and it can nest into however you're currently practicing. I mean, hell, even from from an agile perspective, if you're doing like a daily stand-up, for example, you can easily apply something like, okay, if you haven't already done it, which it is a part of the process, but let's just say for funsies, like, oh, you two are working on projects. Does that nest up into a, do those nest in a larger whole? All of a sudden we're like, oh, well, we should probably change the way we're doing our work if those nest up into a larger whole. Or if they don't, maybe we should divest the work differently so that people who are working on similar projects can, be, for instance, working closer together, as opposed to having people who are working at the same projects geographically separated. The questions, the DSRP as framing to your questions, I think are a really handy way to cut across the board into whatever specific aspect of things that you're looking at to get at, I think, some really some really interesting insights, at least. Other Daniel Griffith had a question about different schools of systems thinking. And so I will answer that now, I guess. I've been avoiding this question since I started today, but now I will answer it. The answer is yes. They roughly fall into 4 waves of systems practice as a whole. The first wave is sort of your hard systems perspective. So think like network theory and other ways to quantify systems in different ways. It's typified by your network theory. The second perspective is your softer implementations of systems thinking. There's a really good book about this specific wave called Systems Thinking, Systems Practice by Peter Checkland, who he basically was like, I am going to take the practices of hard systems practice and I'm going to take them into soft problems, and I'm going to see where it falls apart and change the methodologies until it stops falling apart. That covers this section pretty well. There's the third wave, which basically aimed to be kind of like a meet between the more quantitative first wave and the more qualitative second wave. But it added a critical lens to it. So you see things like critical systems theory pop up. You see things like pluralistic views of systems pop up here in this era. And then your final wave is apparently pioneered by Derek Cabrera, and I think they call it the metacognitive wave, which is finding the connection between basically parallelism, right? Our brains developed in parallel with our world, and we both experience DSRP, and so therefore our brain is a complex adaptive system, and so it's the world. And so, our goal then is to find the best match of our mental models to the real world. And so that's kind of like easy wave tops of the different ways people have expressed systems thought. In terms of systems thinking, you'll find, like systems thinking proper, you'll find there's a group of people called systems innovation. They have, I think they exist on LinkedIn. They have their own like Mighty Networks group. They do systems thinking from a particular perspective where they do causal loop diagrams, they do stock flow diagrams, other ways to model systems. I think what you'll find actually is that a lot of the schools of thought around systems thinking are specifically centered around what are the best ways to model systems. And so you have like, you know, you have your causal loop diagrams, which I used to like for a long time, which are basically a less in-depth version of DSRP mapping, in that you here. So you could say effectively, okay, here's a loop, right? And let's just say that this is, I don't know, population of wolves. This is population of, I don't know what wolves prey on, honestly. I'm not a biologist or a person who's knowledgeable about wolves. But and then we can mark these as, okay, as the population of wolves increases, the population of wolves prey decreases. And so on and so forth, or the opposite is true. As the population of wolves decrease, the population of wolves prey increases. That's a simple example of a causal loop diagram. There's stock flow charts, like I mentioned before, or stock flow diagrams, I think they're called. They saw their best implementation, I think, in the book Thinking in Systems by Dana Meadows. Donella Meadows, if you're specifically looking for the book, but she went by Dana. She came out of the school of system dynamics, which is what informed the book. I was going to say The Fifth Element, but I'm thinking about movies for some reason. The Fifth Discipline. Also, the book Thinking in Systems. Actually, MIT specifically is the pioneer of system dynamics, which is one of the reasons why it's as popular as it is. It's because you got a lot of prominent thinkers who came out of MIT in a specific time who were thinking about systems in these types of ways. Yeah, and the beer game is really interesting. I still think about it, actually. What is doubly interesting is if you read Dana Meadows' book, you'll find precursors to that game in theory form in her book, which is why I have problems with singing a little bit, but that's another story. Yeah, I'm gonna shut up again. Anything else? I can keep talking. Don't feel bad about keep talking. Just like, let me take a pause, ask a question, or keep leaving if you want to.
Before we wrap up, I did want to urge everybody here to jump into the systems thinking channel in Agitare Slack, because there's a ton of resources shared there. It's called Topic Systems Thinking. And Adam just sent me a artifact. Adam K, not you, Adam. That's a culmination. That's like a stitched together PDF of all of the Cabrera's website summaries. So it's another good resource. Ooh, you want to know how to join the Slack?
Oh yeah, Emmanuel is in the chat. Is in the Slack group yet? She should be. She's great. I'm glad she's here.
I'll drop the link.
To answer your question, David, the book is called Systems Thinking, Systems Practice, written by Checkland. I think it was written in like the 60s. What I have to say? Yes, you had a question.
Yeah, I know we don't, we're coming up to time, but when you do have that conversation, I believe it was Stephanie in regards to like systems thinking and DEI. And I think there was someone else, a couple of people in chat too. Definitely would be interested in joining that conversation.
Yeah, so I think the best place to plan when to have that conversation is going to be on Agitare somewhere, probably in Agitare Slack, either in the systems thinking one, or you can make a whole new channel just at the cross section. But either way, if you're in Agitare, you'll learn that it exists, because I do think it's an important place to put some thought into.
Alrighty, sounds good. And thank you so much for sharing the Airtable. Gonna fill that out.
Of course. All right. Anything else? I will say, so yeah, Daniel did say that Adam K did the whole like synthesis of pages on the Cabrera's website, but there, in case you don't see it, their website is great. One of the things I really like about them as educators in public space is that they really don't put their research behind paywalls at all. So it's all of their research is hosted on their website in some way. It's not the best design website, so you kind of have to like hunt around for it, but it is there at least. But I'm gonna, here's their blog. And then I will also send you the resources page in chat. Yeah, and they're, well, actually I said that just to David. Enjoy, David, but here's for everybody else. So I sent just the blog in general and then the resources page, both which have more than you'll ever need as it relates to their mode of systems thinking. Coincidentally, that site also has various courses that they teach. I'm not gonna tell you to do them or not. That's up to you and what you want to do. But seeing as they have a lot of their materials out for free, you know, encouraged just to look into them as you see fit. Well, I think we're gonna call it now. I want to at least honor the 12. I will stay around for people who just want to talk with me, just like not with everybody else around. But at this point, I am telling people to leave now. Thank you so much for your time, all of you. I really appreciate it. It means a lot for me, for you all to show up and be a part of this weird thing where I decided not to read from slides and just like, yeah, we'll do this back and forth of asking me questions and I will answer them in the way that the thing is structured, as opposed to doing it the other way. So thank you. We will have this recorded. I don't know, because I will not listen to it because I hate to hear my own voice. I in fact hate to see myself on video even. So I've had to like hide my own like screen, but it'll exist somewhere, I'm sure. And that'll be another way to look at that'll be another reason to look at the Agitare Slack for it, because it'll probably be there first before it is made public. So thank you, everybody. I really appreciate your time. I'll see you all on the internet somewhere, I'm sure.